Rachel, it's great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation.
Me too. So we have three questions and I'll jump right in. I have heard that illegal immigration has actually decreased since COVID restrictions have been removed. Is it possible that Biden's increased border is actually effective?
It's very clear that the number of border crossings has diminished since since the Biden administration implemented their new policy earlier this spring. But there are widespread concerns, even among Biden administration officials, that this decrease is temporary. Now, what Biden did, let's review, is that after the Trump administration implemented the so-called Title 42 provisions, which made it much more difficult for an individual to request asylum, the Biden administration did is it replaced those stricter requirements instead with a new set of parameters that on one hand made it made it more difficult for individuals to come into this country illegally, primarily by increasing the penalty that would be imposed upon them if they were caught. Under the Title 42 provision, if an individual was apprehended, they'd simply be returned across the border. And what happened is frequently they would make a second, third, fourth, multiple attempts to cross the border and come into the United States. What Biden's new provision did, while on one hand lessening the burdens of Title 42, it also increased the penalty if someone came into this country without documentation and was apprehended. Previously, as I said a moment ago, that individual would simply try again and again and again, if necessary, in order to secure residency in this country. What the Biden administration has now done is imposed a 5-year ban on anyone who is apprehended that would prohibit them from trying again for that period of time. A lot of potential emigres heard about this potential change before it was implemented. So in the days before the change happened, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of individuals coming across the border seeking asylum. Once the new process was put in place, we saw a drop-off. But as I said earlier, any number of observers and any number of Biden administration officials believe that as time passes, we will see an increased appetite for individuals and families to come across the border. So in the short run, this is really good news for the Biden administration. On the flip side, they're a little bit reluctant to brag about it too much because they are concerned that those numbers and those trends could reverse very, very quickly.
Our next audience member asked, back in poli-sci, we learned that people vote their pocketbooks. Is this still true?
For many, many years, the most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior, whether an individual would vote Republican or Democrat, was their income. The more money they made, the more likely they were to vote Republican. The less money they made, the more likely they were to vote Democrat. But in recent years, we've seen an entirely different trend emerging. In the latter part of the 20th century, more and more voters in both parties began casting their ballot not on economic issues, but on cultural and social issues. And so what we saw, for example, was large numbers of higher income voters switching from the Republican to the Democratic Party because of issues like abortion rights and gun control and same-sex marriage. On the flip side, we saw a very large number of working class voters switching from the Democrat to the Republican Party on the basis of their position on precisely the same issues. This trend was intensified during Donald Trump's campaign, but it's one that had existed for quite some time beforehand. In fact, in the early 2000s, in 2004, for the first time, when George Bush and John Kerry ran against each other for president, for the first time, we saw that the single most reliable indicator in partisan voting behavior was no longer income, but rather what the political scientists refer to as religiosity, the frequency with which an individual attends religious services. So for those individuals who attended religious services once a week or more, whether those religious services took place in a church or in a synagogue or another house of worship, those individuals were far more likely to vote Republican. And those who attended religious services once a month or less were much more likely to vote Democratic. As I said, that shift happened for the first time in the 2004 election, but it's grown even more in a more marked way since then. So while the questioner is right, for much of modern American political history, voters tended to make their decision based on their income level. More and more, we see those decisions made not on economic matters, but on cultural and social concerns, which not coincidentally have increased the polarization in our political process and in American society.
That's fascinating. For our final question, if Biden is not able to run, who will be the Democratic candidate?
I think the biggest question would be, if Biden were to decide not to run, when would that decision be made? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that President Biden, whether because of health reasons or for any other reason, decided in early 2024 not to seek the Democratic nomination for president. In that case, it would be very difficult for any Democrat other than Vice President Harris to mount a successful primary campaign. Harris, make no mistake about it, starts with an advantage as the sitting vice president, but it's not a prohibitive advantage. A lot of voters, even Democratic voters, have real doubts about Harris's work as vice president and her potential as a presidential candidate. So if Biden were to decide not to run in 2023, between now and the end of this calendar year, and perhaps even in the first month or two of 2024, at that point, rather than a decided Harris advantage, like we'd see if Biden's decision were made later in 2024, instead, my guess is you would see a very large number of Democratic candidates entering the race. And at that point, it's anyone's guess. Harris would certainly run. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, our own governor here in California, Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governors of Illinois and New Jersey, J.B. Pritzker and Phil Murphy, and probably at least a half a dozen members of either the House or the Senate. So ultimately, if Biden were to decide not to run at some point next year, Vice President Harris is the odds-on favorite to become the nominee. But if you were to make the decision between now and, let's say, for sake of argument, next February, then at that point, you'd see a real free-for-all.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. And I know we'll be talking about that last question much more in depth next month. So I'll be looking forward to that.
That's right. One of our main points of focus for the July webinar is going to be, who might the party nominees be if not Biden and Trump? So I'm definitely looking forward to that conversation too.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dan. Have a good rest of your day.
You too, Rachel. I'll see you in early July.
Okay, great.